So that's enough for you just to be reflective right now.
Mm-hmm.
You're feeling and thinking when you hear about these stories like Renisha McBride. What was your impression initially?
Um, it's similar to the way I felt about Trayvon. I mean, it's the same. Is that it makes me sad, and it makes me hurt, and it makes me angry. Um, because I study history. I'm a historian, and we've been here before. And when I look at the rise of the right today, with the Tea Party, and the whole country moving to the right around a discussion of the public and the demonization of the poor, the demonization of black people, it leads to an element of hate. Um, just like after Reconstruction in the United States, when you had the rise of the Klan and you had murders of black people. And the justification back then was that black men were raping white women. So now the justification right now is that black people are criminals and thugs. Um, so I'm scared, really, about the period that we're in and that we're going in. I think we need to be much more vigilant, or we're going to wake up and be in fascism before we know it. And black people are going to be at the brunt of that. It's so interesting. Yesterday there was a discussion on TV around Veterans Day on MSNBC. I forget what show it was. Chris Hayes, I think. How the Republicans, when they passed this farm bill, or they arguing around the farm bill, that they took out the SNAP program or the food stamps program as a part of the farm bill. What was interesting yesterday is a whole lot of veterans are homeless, and a whole lot of veterans need food stamps. And so the question is, when they did that, did they mean to hurt veterans, or just poor people, or just black people? Not quite understanding that the so-called veterans that they think deserve something are actually being hurt as well. So anyway, it makes me angry, it makes me hurt, and I want people to wake up, because I see a future that's much bleaker than it was 30 years ago.
Well, I guess we'll get back to the two ladies, but I see here on your flyer for the Without Borders conference.
Yes.
You're talking about radical transgressions.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about waking up, how far do we need to wake up and transgress?
I think we need to wake up. And I see a lot of movement around the country, so I didn't want to leave it when I say I think the future is bleak. I think the trajectory of the right in what they're trying to do has the potential to be bleak, but I see a lot of young people rising up, a lot of pushback, a lot of social justice activism, and I think we need more. We need more connection of all the movements around the country. What's happening, like with Detroit and what's happening in Michigan, I read a quote the other day that Shay Howell, who works at Oakland University in Detroit, said 55% of black voters in Michigan have had their votes discounted by the city manager, overseer positions in the city, in Detroit, in Flint, in Benton Harbor. And so basically their votes have been rendered worthless, because they can no longer vote for their elected official who's going to run the cities. I think that radical transgressions are people who are pushing against that. There's a move in this country to privatize absolutely everything. Privatize public schools, privatize cities. If we don't push back hard, water's already kind of privatized, but it's even going to be privatized more. So I think that we need more radical transgressions, like the Occupy movement. In Chicago, you have a police crimes task force. You have people in Florida fighting against Stand Your Ground, the young students from FAMU who took over the governor's mansion and office after the murder of Trayvon. So I think we need more and more and more of this radical activity, and we need to call it out. The market can't solve everything. We need a public sector. We need a sector where people can rub up against each other. We need a sector where people have opportunities. I'm against the privatization of schools. Even some charter schools. I think a lot of people are so frustrated with public schools that they even get lured into, even in the black community, that charter schools are better. But once you have a private school, the reason for that school is generally for somebody, if it's a business, somebody wants to make money off of it, not necessarily to educate kids. And so to me, those things can be in conflict with each other. And I really think that we need to, move away from the market and more towards a public sector. The reason public schools are in trouble is because of no funding. That's the reason they're in trouble. And without funding and without social workers, without nurses in schools, and you have a lot of young people who, with the recent, economic downturn, their parents don't have jobs, there's no hope. And so you end up with a situation where people come to school, kids come to school with a lot of problems at the very same time that classes are overcrowded and you don't have funding for social workers and nurses. So the problem with the public schools should not lead us to privatization. It should lead us to more funding and more support for public schools. So I think there's a lot of things happening in the country, but we need more of it, and we need it to be more connected.
Initially, what were you, because we only have about 7 minutes, let's go back to here in Kalamazoo and your thoughts about racial profiling, what the short-term issue and fix should be, and what should be, how should they be held accountable in the long run?
Well, the interesting thing about that's not a very good question for me because I haven't studied the details here in Kalamazoo.
Okay, that's all right.
But
the structural issues behind.
I think racial profiling is a big problem. I mean, the stop and frisk in New York showed that actually it didn't even work as crime prevention. Actually, the majority of people they stopped were not involved in crime.
Right.
So the issue is, why are they looking at us when in fact crime is happening? It's a really interesting situation. So, I mean, racial profiling is happening all over the country. It's been happening all over the country. And I think with this rise of hate and demonization of black people, again, today, that it's even going to get worse. What did I read? I read that in LA, in 2012, in LA, in 100% of the cases where dogs were used to chase and bite people, to catch so-called criminals, in 100% of the cases, dogs were used on black and Latino and people of color in LA. 100%. No dog chased or bit a white person in LA. And so I think we're looking at, what some people are calling the rise of the security state. And it really goes along with, if you deny people food stamps, if you deny people jobs, if you deny people hope, then the question is, how do you deal with a population that is oppressed and feeling that desperation? You have the rise of policing to handle those populations. And so we're in the term that people are using is the neoliberal state. That is, everything is going to be market driven. People's needs to eat, people's needs for housing are secondary to the drive for the market and to make money. And my worry is that that this is the path we're on. And as social justice activists, we need to be really vigilant. We need to read. We need to study. We need to connect. We need to be involved. We need to be creative. We need to be visionaries. We need to be bold, and we need to be brave to challenge what's upon us now.
So if someone comes to you and say, Dr. Brock, we need you to sit on this committee, we need to give this, the response to this racial profiling study some legs. We need to hold the city accountable in measurable terms to make sure that they don't just, change the data or, evaluate that for their own purposes or they just do a short-term fix or sweep it under the rug. What comes to your mind about making it wholly accountable? Kind of some steps.
Well, one of the things that a lot of cities are trying to do is to have a citywide commission on police accountability so that there's an overseer body. I mean, right now, in a lot of cities, and I'm not sure about Kalamazoo, but it's the mayor of a given city. Um, um, but how do you make police accountable to the people that pay their salaries, which is the community? Um, One of the things that's always concerned me is, what often happens is police don't get charged with a crime if in fact they're engaged in some major violence. It takes a lot to get a police to be charged with a crime, and a lot more to get them convicted of a crime, to call unlawful use of violence, in the killing or the beating or that kind of thing. But what often happens in cities like Chicago and LA and New York is, let's say the family members then take the city to court for someone who's been killed in their family by a policeman, and then the city will then it'll be a civil suit, and the city will then pay out money to the family. But that civil suit is also our tax dollars. So we're paying taxes to the city to pay for problematic police in some of these cities. The violence, I think, in Kalamazoo, I haven't heard that much of violence in Kalamazoo. I know that there is racial profiling and stop and frisk and stop and ask questions. But I'm not sure how the Kalamazoo community is responding to that. Is there a commission afoot for that?
I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so at all. We're going to be asking two of the city commissioners and hopefully the chief during a focus group.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to hold hopefully in early December.
Good.
So what questions would you ask them if you were doing the focus group?
What's your accountability process for a police that stepped over the line around racial profiling? How do you instruct police to track crime? What's the culture of the police around certain communities in Kalamazoo? So I think, I'd have to think about it a lot more, but the issue would be to try to get at how police are being trained and what they're being encouraged to do, and if it's coming from the top or if it's coming just from the policemen themselves. I would imagine that it's a little bit of both in most police departments.
You touched on this, that people will say, well, and they're using this, and the Mayor Bloomberg in New York is using this. Well, we're going where the crime is.
Mm-hmm.
People have said that, in response to blogs here on the Kalamazoo Gazette. Mm-hmm. What do you say to that?
Well, there's a lot of crimes on Wall Street. There's a lot of crimes in the banks. And studies have shown there's a lot of white crime that doesn't get policed or even noticed because they're not looking there, So in some ways, I don't know if you know the book, the Urban League does this biannual State of Black America. Mm-hmm. I would suggest you look at the most recent one. I haven't seen it, but every 2 years they put out this, and there's statistics about policing, about discrimination in employment and housing and policing of African Americans. And one of the studies in Chicago illustrated that in something like 85% of the cases where young whites were stopped for drug violations in the city of Chicago, they were simply patted on the hand and sent back out to their suburbs when they were in the city buying drugs, where in 90% of the cases for blacks, they were actually taken to the police station. And as we know, the so-called war on drugs is definitely a war on black people and people of color, because statistics show that white people use drugs as much, if not more, than black people. But somehow black people are the ones being arrested for drug violations and jailed. So it's about where you're looking to find the crime. My answer to that would be there's a lot of crime that you don't see because you're not in those neighborhoods.
And this is so appropriate. Is it Without Borders? Mm-hmm. Can you just give us a synopsis on that?
We're having a great conference next September. Mm-hmm. The entire Kalamazoo community is welcome. We want to interrogate the notion of borders, which of course what you're talking about is a part of it, the border between a white community and a black community, and how different the treatment can be in terms of city services, in terms of schools, in terms of policing, that there's a border between the rich and the poor, there's a border between white and non-white in this country, that we want to interrogate, we want to challenge. And we're looking at this also internationally. This policing, I mean, you'd be surprised. The kinds of things that are happening in this country, of course, are also happening in other parts of the world. And we want to look at policing internationally. We want to look at political prisoners. We want to look at challenges around nation-state borders and what happens when a big country comes in and decides to take over your water system. We want to look at what's happening to challenge this. So when we talk about radical transgressions, we're talking about where are people around the world challenging these borders? Where are they deciding that the border is not going to be policed the way you think it is? That we need new ways of thinking and envisioning our world. And in fact, the subtitle to the conference is called "Without Borders, Let's Remap the World." So we're encouraging people to think about the world they want and not just the world that we're in.
International example would be what? I know Lana mentioned Palestine.
And also in the Honduras right now. There was a U.S.-backed coup in the Honduras a few years ago. And so interesting, one of our finalists was a group of land and water sovereignty rights in Honduras, one of our finalists for the prize, the Global Social Justice Competition prize that we had. And they couldn't get out of the country. They couldn't get a U.S. visa to come. But what they're fighting for down there is international companies owning and taking away their land and access to water. And these are peasants who don't have the money to buy the water. And so you end up with issues like this happening all over the world. So Honduras is another country, Palestine is a country. There are peasants and farmers in Brazil who are dealing with very similar issues. And even in poor Haiti, where you had that earthquake, what's happened in Haiti is the buildup of an entire kind of NGO system that is actually, people have called the poverty industrial complex, where people go in to help and end up setting up communities for the helpers, and the people that actually need to be helped are actually not receiving that. So
how does that work?
Well, it's very interesting. You have all of these kind of gated and walled communities all over Haiti now. And so this is another thing we want to look at. I mean, what does this mean to have gated communities in this period? It means you want to protect your property very often against those who have no property. But the question is, why don't those have anything? That's the question, not the fence, not the wall. But that's a solution to things around the world. So what's happened in Haiti is you have a lot of these NGOs that are supposedly doing good work, but they're living in bubbles. And the poverty, the tent cities, they still exist in Haiti ever since the earthquake.
So, Lana said there was a connection between the criminal justice systems and the techniques they use in Palestine, as the same techniques they use here in the U.S.?
I'm not an expert on that.
Okay, I was just thinking that was fascinating. But there's this prison industrial complex at the root of what you're trying to get into.
That's one of the things.
That's one, and then what are the other?
Well, we're talking about radical transgressions, emergent epistemologies. Do you know what that means?
The way we learn?
Yes, and what's happening? Where are the emergent knowledge sectors and places? They're not always in colleges and universities. Where's the innovative thinking about education, about new thinking for the 21st century, about what we're going to do for the 21st century? I mean, I came up, in a period of a lot of hope and activism in the 60s, 70s, and I'm worried about where that is now, with the turn back on voter rights, the Stand Your Ground, which is allowing people to kill people with impunity, gun violence, the skyrocketing price of higher education, the undermining of public education at the lower levels. And so we want to see where people are thinking about our future in terms of the future of education. And it might not be in the halls of academia. It may actually be happening somewhere else. So we want to know what people are thinking. So border crossing in terms of radical transgressions, emergent epistemologies, and then critical solidarities. Where are the solidarity movements happening? Where are the allies of people who are fighting for social justice around the world? So we're interested in looking at that as well.